global settings or a settings page, posture general settings page, you would notice this an info icon, info. If at all any device is matching against the client provisioning policy and that client provisioning policy was having a profile associated with it, then the agent profile is going to take a precedence. Till that point, if there is no profile defined against the client provisioning policy, then these posture general settings is going to get applied. It means basically these are the global settings, and you can basically override them using the agent posture profile, which is going to be mapped to the agent config, and that agent config can be associated to the client provisioning policy. So whatever you defined under agent posture profile is going to take the precedence. Let's take an example. The remediation timer by default set to 4 minutes in the ISE global settings. And if you have defined something else in the agentless posture profile, that agentless posture profile remediation timer is going to take a precedence. This is just an example of one of the parameters. So let's take a look at the demonstration. So let's go to the work center, posture work center settings, posture general settings. You could see that the remediation timer was already set to 4 minutes. This is by default setting. And we could override it using the client provisioning. Remember, we were making use of ISE posture profile. Let's take a look at this agent profile. I just modified it to 15 minutes, the remediation timer. And I've also enabled the rescan button. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I wanted to actually enable one of the posture policy. So along with the posture policies that we defined earlier in the part 1 session, I wanted to define a file policy, enable file policy. I've defined it, which was looking for a file existence on an endpoint. So let's save this posture policy. Let's flip over to the endpoint, connect to the network. Cisco Secure Client is going to automatically discover the PSN, tries to retrieve the posture policy. It figured it out that the file that we were looking for is not available on the endpoint desktop. So it was giving me the remediation to remediation as well. And the remediation timer was set to 15 minutes now, if you look at it. So that 15 minutes, within that 15 minutes, the remediation has to be taken place. So I'm going to actually go ahead and remediate the system by downloading the file offered by the Cisco Secure Client. Now, that's how you basically override anything under the agentless posture profile with the global settings. Sorry, anything with the global settings can be overridden with an agent profile. Now let's go to the next one, the posture lease. By default, ISE is going to assess the posture of an endpoint connecting to the network every time. So if an endpoint is connecting to the network, every time it connects to the network, it goes through the posture assessment in order to get the latest posture status of the endpoint. But however, you have one more option in order to give out a lease in terms of days to the endpoint. Just a minute. So in order to give the lease time defined in days to the endpoint, so that, let's say, take an example like I was showing up over here, we could extend the lease period of 1 day to the endpoint. So the endpoint connecting to the network doesn't have to go through the posture assessment every time connecting to the network within that lease period. It has to be associated with the last compliance status of that endpoint. Why? Let me tell you. So when the endpoint connected to the network, consider these endpoints are connecting to the network for the first time, and ISE doesn't even know what was the posture of that endpoint. Now, initially, we're going to provision the endpoint, Cisco Secure Client. Cisco Secure Client discovers the PSN, goes through the posture evaluation, policies evaluation, submits the report back to the ISE, and ISE, because we have enabled the posture assessment on a daily basis. It's going to update its cache with the compliance status, whatever the endpoints going through this compliance status, right? Those endpoints are going to be updated in its cache, and then the lease period is going to be given to the endpoint. So no matter how many times the endpoint connected to the network within this one single day, or probably one day, it's going to get a compliant access right away. So Cisco Secure Client doesn't even go through the posture policy evaluation. So when it connects back to the network again, Cisco Secure Client, again, it looks for the PSN, request the posture policies, but however, ICE says, hey, your lease time is still valid. You don't have to actually evaluate any posture policy. So it extends that posture lease time. Basically, behind the scenes, Cisco Secure Client was having a token along with the validity, the lease validity. So the token, as long as the token is valid, it's going to basically get the lease time, remaining lease time. So if I lay out this in a time graph, let's say the endpoints connecting to the network for the first time, and it got 24 hours lease time, one day. Now, it doesn't matter whether it is connecting back to the network with a new session or a old session after 4 hours or after 16 hours, it's going to get the remaining lease time. So beyond 24 hours, when it connects back to the network, that's when the ICE will forcefully ask the Cisco security client to assess the posture policies again, to get back the again 1 day posture lease period. So that's how it works. Let's see it in the action. So let's go to the posture work center and let's look at a general setting. By default, this is what the setting it's going to be enabled. Perform posture assessment every time the user connects to the network. Sorry. So that's how basically the default setting enabled. So every time the user connects to the network, it's going to go through the posture assessment. Let's look at it as a recap instead of enabling it straight away. Let's go to the live log. Let's go to the endpoint. Let me flip over to the endpoint. Connect to the network. It was connected to the network, and security client was assessing the posture policies, getting back the compliance status. Now, this is the typical journey of an endpoint going through the posture service. Initially, the posture status is going to be in pending state. Then after it can move to compliant or non-compliant state. So we can tie it with the session ID to understand it better. Let's enable the session ID. If you look at the session ID, for the new session ID that was actually connecting to the network for a specific endpoint, initially it got a pending. That means posted unknown access was given. Once after it became compliant, we have issued a COA and then have given compliant access to it. This is the typical life journey of an endpoint going through posture assessment every time it connects to the network. Now, instead of this, I wanted to actually give a lease period to the endpoint so that it doesn't have to go through the posture assessment. So let's enable posture assessment every 1 day, enable the cache, and a compliant state also to be kept for 30 days. Now let's flip over to the endpoint and let's disconnect the endpoint and connect it back again. Now this time again, Cisco Secure Client was looking for posture policies, submitted the report back to the ICE. Let's flip over to the ICE live log. Look at it. ICE was ICE was actually giving it a posture lease time to the endpoint because the lease was actually given to the endpoint enabled until. Now, notice that this is coming over the new session ID. Even though it is on a new session ID, it doesn't have to go through the posture service evaluation. Let's disconnect it and connect back again so that we will get a new session. Let's flip over to live log and see what's happening. Notice that we got a new session ID and straight away it got a compliant access. Now, Cisco Secure Client doesn't even evaluating the posture policies, no matter how many times it connects to the network again and again within that lease period. In this example, 1 day, it is not even evaluating the posture policies. So in order to confirm this, if you go to the posture assessment by endpoint report, initially it evaluated the posture policy and got the posture assessment report. No matter how many times you connect it to the network, we haven't got the posture report from the endpoint because it is not even evaluating any posture policies because the release time was extended to it. So even if you scan it again and again couple of times, you would notice that you wouldn't even get any posture assessment report onto the ISE. So that's how you can basically give a posture lease to the endpoint with the help of cache period. Now let's talk about a flexible grace period. Flexible grace period, I would give an example, something like, consider a situation your security administrator was looking for the latest patches on all your endpoints, be it critical, latest, optional, whatever updates. In order for the endpoints to uh, download those updates from the update server and install them, it would take probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes based on the updates available. So till that point, that posture policy gets evaluated to true, we are not going to give him a compliant access. But as a security administrator or for an end user experience standpoint, we don't want to actually, let's say if we don't want to actually let them stuck at the initial posture unknown access level itself, we could extend some grace period so that they can actually remediate themselves within that grace period, so that after the grace period, still if they become non-compliant against the policies, then we can basically give them a non-compliant access to it. So that's how you can basically extend some grace period set at a posture policy level. How does it work? So when Cisco Secure Client requests for posture policy evaluation, consider a situation we have defined multiple posture policies. Posture policy 1, 2, 3, and 4. At each and every posture policy level, you can define the grace period, X, Y, Z. And this X, Y, Z, basically, they can be defined in hours, days, or minutes. So amongst all these X, Y, Z, whichever is greatest or lengthiest period, that's what you're going to get the grace period access to. Now, Cisco Secure Client doesn't even actually know what is the grace period it is going to get. It's defined at the ISE level. It's just evaluate the posture policies and submit the report back to the ISE. Now, ISE will look into its cache. The grace period is going to be extended to the endpoints only when its previous status was compliant. That's the reason why we were keeping the last compliant status of each and every endpoint in the cache, and we were defining how many days that we have to retain that cache period for all these endpoints. So when a secure client submits the report back to ISE, it looks for whether the previous state is compliant or not. If at all it is compliant, then it's going to update the cache and it's going to extend the grace period to the endpoint. Z is greatest amongst X, Y, Z set at the posture policies level. So that's how it works. Now, that was the reason why it becomes very much important for us to enable the cache last known posture compliance status and keep it in whatever days that you define. Now, let's see it in the action. Let's go to the work center. In order to actually do the demonstration of this, I'm going to make use of one of the posture policy that we have enabled earlier. That is nothing but a file policy. And I'm going to give a grace period of 30 minutes if at all it is not meeting. And I wanted to notify as well at a 50% for grace period. That means at a 15th minute, we wanted to let the end user know that, hey, you still have some grace period left, but you are supposed to go through the remediation in order to get the compliant access. So we can notify it as well. So save the configuration. Let's flip over to the endpoint. Remember, we were looking for the file existence on these endpoints. So let's delete this file, what we were looking during the posture evaluation. Let's connect to the network. Now, Cisco Secure Client is going to assess the posture policy. It figured it out that there is no file that we were looking for. So instead of starting the remediation, I'm going to cancel the remediation. That means this endpoint is becoming a non-compliant against that specific file policy that we have defined. So if I'm not wrong, this endpoint is supposed to get a 30 minutes grace period. So this is how the end user is going to get notified whenever any specific posture policies are not met. We can give some grace period in order to get the compliant access to remediate his system. So within this grace period, the end user is supposed to remediate his system, and we could even notify during this remediation time period. So consider a situation, I'm connecting this endpoint again after 4 to 5 minutes. What's going to happen? Even after I connect to the network after 4 minutes, let's say 4 to 5 minutes, let's disconnect the endpoint, let's connect it back. Again, it's going through the posture policy evaluation. Again, it figured it out that there is no file that was supposed to be there. So I'm canceling the remediation offer. So because I connected the system back after 4 minutes, I'm supposed to get probably 26 minutes, 30 minutes for 26 minutes remaining grace period. Yes, I'm right. So I got a 26 minutes or a 25 minutes, so and so seconds, the grace period left. So no matter how many times you connect to the network within this grace period, it's going to go through the posture policies evaluation, and it's going to give the remaining grace period to the endpoint. So if I come back to the reports, how do I figure it out, the grace period given to the endpoint? So if you notice this, usually the compliant endpoints are going to be shown with this green color tick mark. Whereas for grace compliant access endpoints, we're going to be showing with a blue color question mark icon. So that you can basically filter it out based on the status grace compliant to figure it out what are the endpoints which are getting the grace compliant access to. Now, remember the situation, we were trying to notify the end user at a 50% of a grace period too. So unfortunately, it gone past the 15 minute. I'm at 11th minute now, and it evaluated the posture policies again. Still, it was not compliant against some of the posture policies, stating that some of the posture policies were not compliant against with it, and I still got 11 minutes. Let this 11 minutes actually get expired. I'm just fast forwarding it. Let this 1 minute also gets expired, less than a minute. So once the grace period gets expired, Cisco Secure Client automatically evaluates the posture policies. And if you are still not compliant against those posture policies, you will be given non-compliant access instead of compliant access. So that's how it evaluated again. Now it gave me non-compliant access. Yeah, that's how you are basically getting non-compliant access. So within the grace period that you have defined, the end user is supposed to remediate the system. And we have also capability to notify the end user at a 50% grace period level, or a 40% grace period, 25% grace period level, etc. So that's how the posture flexible grace period works. Now let's come down to the periodic reassessment. Periodic reassessment, the name itself implies that we wanted to periodically reassess the posture of an endpoint again and again. So it's basically, you have three options at the reassessment level, the enforcement level. You can basically have a continue, log off, or a remediate. You can also actually associate this PRA configuration to user groups or an endpoint groups. And the PRA's interval could be from a minimum of 60 minutes to a maximum of 1 day. That means you can reassess the posture of an endpoint for a day, as minimum as 60 minutes or as long as 1 day. So how does it work? Let's see it in the action. Now let's go to the Posture Work Center and let's look at the reports first of all. We haven't defined the PRA action as of now. So whatever the posture assessment reports that we were getting from the endpoints, the PRA action was not applicable. That means we haven't even defined the PRA action. So let's define the PRA action now. Let's make sure we have the default posture assessment. Every time the user connects to the network, we wanted to do the posture evaluation. Just make sure that we have set to it. And let's define the PRA configuration, define the name of it. You have three options available: continue, log off, remediate. Continue means, consider a situation every reassessment, every 60 minutes, let's say, every 1 hour, we wanted to reassess the posture policies. Even though it's not compliant, we wanted to give a compliant access. So the end user is going to continue to get the compliant access if you set the enforcement type to continue. If you set the enforcement type to remediate, it will allow the end user to remediate his system. If you set the enforcement type to log off, it will kick off the session and it will have to go through the posture assessment again from the fresh. So those are the options available, and the interval could be a minimum of 1 hour to a maximum of 24 hours. So let's define 60 minutes and let's associate to all the endpoints, irrespective of a specific endpoints or a specific user. We wanted to set it to every user. And let's update the enforcement type to remediate, because we don't want to get them continue to get the compliant access at every PRA level. That would be a better option for me, in my opinion. So let's define the grace period, 5 minutes. What is this grace period exactly? Consider a situation every 1 hour we were doing a posture assessment on these endpoints. If one of the posture policy is not compliant against the one single endpoint, that endpoint is going to get 5 minutes grace period in order to meet the requirements. That's what the grace period was given to the endpoint during the PRU. Now that we have defined this, let's do one thing. Let's go to the endpoint. Let's connect it to the network. Let it go through the posture evaluation initially. Now that we got a compliant access, let's flip over to the reports, work center posture reports, and look at it. PRA action was enforced on the endpoint, and it's nothing but remediation. So every time, every 1 hour, these endpoints are going to be assessed through the posture evaluation. So how do I figure it out whether we are getting the posture reassessment report versus a normal report? If you look at the message over here, that's where you can figure it out whether it is a reassessment report or a normal assessment report. So that's the differentiating factor. But ultimately what we were doing, every 1 hour, we were trying to actually reassess the posture policies on the endpoint so that it is compliant against all my posture policies. That's what we were trying to do it. Now let's come down to the next remaining agent types. Stealth agent, I don't have any slide to demonstrate anything over here because the stealth agent is typically a service running behind. There is no UI. Cisco Secure Client Posture module is not going to be available for the end user. It's just that service is going to be there running behind the endpoint, and it's going to evaluate the posture policies. That's the only difference between the normal agent versus stealth agent. Let's see it in the action in order to understand this. So how do we define the stealth agent? if I if you remember correctly, we were making use of ISE posture profile. That's an agent profile that we were making use of. Let's edit it. And if you notice that you have an option called stealth mode, it was disabled by default. You can enable it in order to enter into stealth mode. And we have also option to notify the end user even in the stealth mode in order to give a better user experience whenever it becomes a non-compliant or a compliant, whenever it is giving you the limited access, etc. We can notify the end user through those notifications. So we have enabled stealth mode, enabled the notifications. That's what we require. And let's save this agent profile. Now let's flip over to the endpoint. It's already connected to the network. I don't want to disconnect and connect it back because we got a enable rescan button was enabled. So I can do a scan again. I can trigger scan again in order to get the latest posture updates or latest posture profile updates. So if I click on this scan again, what's happening is it's basically contacting the PSN. It's retrieving the latest profile updates from the PSN, where it was asking you to go, asking Cisco Secure Client to enable the stealth mode. So that's when basically your Cisco Secure Client posture module is going to get vanished. But however, the posture module or a service is running behind. So VPN agent is basically we require. That's a prerequisite in order to install any posture service on the any connect or a Cisco Secure Client. So how do we know whether the posture service is running behind the scenes? Let's disconnect the system and connect back again. So you can notice that there is a notification shown to the endpoint. So the service is running behind the scene and it was evaluating the posture policies still. Okay, so there is no difference between the normal persistent agent versus a stealth agent. It's just that we don't have any agent module showing up to the end user. In terms of the capabilities, I would come back to it. From the capability standpoint of which agent is better and which agent has more capabilities and which agent has what capability, etc. We're going to come back to it at the end of our session. So that's our stealth agent. Let's come down to the third agent type called agentless. You might be confused about my word agent type, again saying that agentless. So always I'm going to say we don't have a magic wand in order to get the posture of an endpoint. So some technique has to be there in order to get the posture of an endpoint, right? How is it going to work? When these endpoints coming onto the network, connecting over to the network, initially, they might be getting matched with one of the authorization rule, and in that authorization rule, the authorization profile is going to be associated. In that authorization profile, if we allow agentless posture flag, that's when ISE will come to know. We were letting the ISE to know that, hey, ISE, whatever endpoint sessions which were enabled with agentless posture flag, you go and connect to them. How? If at all it is Windows, connect to them over PowerShell. As long as it is Mac operating system, connect to them over shell mechanism. So push the plugin, push the required software script push the required certificate so that with the help of agentless plugin, we're going to retrieve the posture status of the endpoint. It might become compliant or it might not become compliant, whatever it is. So based on the compliant status given, we're going to give them compliant or a non-compliant access accordingly. So this doesn't require any user interaction. You don't have to install any agent on the endpoint as well. That's the beauty of it. But however, from the user experience standpoint, if Pawan is trying to connect to the network for the first time, and if Pawan's system is going through the agentless posture, what is my user experience? It's basically I'm gonna sit for a couple of seconds in order to gain the compliant access, because there is no UI and everything is running behind the scene. I'm not sure whether I got a compliant access, non-compliant access, etc. Right? So the user experience standpoint, it might vary, but from a normal posture assessment standpoint also, because you don't have a UI and this agentless plugin is going to be vanished and there is no service running in the behind, obviously we can't do PRA using the agentless posture. We can't do remediations using the agentless posture currently. Now, how do we do that? Let's see it in the action. Let's go to the work center policy elements, authorization profile. I've already defined an authorization profile called agentless posture profile, in which agentless posture flag is enabled. Now, using this agentless posture authorization profile, let's define a policy. We're making use of this policy set, and we have already authentication policies defined for map.1x VPN. Map authenticated devices, basically they were gleaned through the internal endpoints. For .1x and VPN, they were basically getting authenticated against all user ID stores sequence, in which my external identity stores are also present. And coming down to the authorization policy, whenever the endpoint is connecting to the network over map or a .1x, doesn't matter, I'm giving same posture unknown access, redirect them to the client provisioning policy. So instead of this, I wanted to define, especially for an agentless one, I wanted to define a policy called an agentless posture for the users belonging to my users are actually part of my Active Directory dominion. And as long as the user belongs to this agentless group of users or devices, basically I want them to get agentless posture profile rather than posture unknown access or C profile defined earlier. Now, there might be a situations where the agentless might not work. Let's imagine the situation something else was blocking at the endpoint level or a firewall level in order to let the ISE connect to the endpoint. So if the connection itself is not successful, obviously the agentless is going to be failed and it's going to stuck there at this level itself. So in order to actually have a workaround for this, we can also define one more posture policy or one more authorization rule where the agentless flow was failed. How do we do that? So let's define one more on top of this. Whenever this group of people are going through the agentless posture, and when the session is the dictionary and agentless flow status is the condition. Whenever this flow status gets updated to failure, I want them to be redirected to temporal client provisioning page where we were provisioning the temporal agent. So in order to get the posture assessment still for the endpoints. So save the policies, whatever we defined. Let's go down to the client provisioning policy. And we have already defined a client provisioning policy, especially for a specific MAC address, or as long as the username contains agentless, uh, we were provisioning agentless Windows plugin to the endpoint. So that's what we have already defined. For a failure case, when the agentless flow status becomes failure, we wanted them to be redirected to client provisioning page where we were provisioning the temporal agent to it. So that's the second policy. Now that we have defined the client provisioning policies, let's define some posture policies. Let's define the configuration also. What is the configuration, other configuration that we require? Remember, ICE was trying to connect to the endpoint over a PowerShell or a shell mechanism. So you are supposed to let the ICE know with you using what credentials that IAC is supposed to connect to the connect to the endpoint. So as long as it is a domain joined PC, you can mention what is the domain name and the user credentials. These user credentials are supposed to have local administrative privileges on the endpoint so that it can grab the posture status from the endpoint, it can run the script, etc. So this is the another thing that you're supposed to take into consideration. If you have multiple domains as well, you can even create multiple credentials using multiple domains. So you can look at the settings. By default, it runs over 5985 and 22 ports. So if at all you have to change anything, you can change it. But I'm keeping the defaults as is. And let's define some of the posture policies for agentless. So I've already configured some rules, posture rules, in order to grab the posture status as part of an agentless. So I'm enabling 3 posture policies using the agentless agent type. One is whether I'm having an anti-malware available, and I'm retrieving the hardware and the applications running on the endpoint. So those are the posture policies that we have defined, especially for an agentless. Now let's flip over to the endpoint. Let's connect to the network. And this device was already joined to the Active Directory, and it was already having a user called an agentless. So it's already done. So once it connected to the network, nothing is happening. There is no user interaction, UI interaction, nothing is happening because everything is happening behind the scenes. So you might not be able to figure it out what exactly happening behind the scenes from the client standpoint. But however, from the administrator standpoint, if you look at the live logs, you'll come to know what exactly is happening. So initially it matched with an agentless posture ODSI rule where we were giving agentless posture profile, where agentless posture flag was enabled, and it was able to get a compliance status and given the compliance status to the endpoint. So that's how basically everything is happening behind the scene. From the end user standpoint, he doesn't have to install anything. He doesn't have to run anything. ICE will try to push the plugin into it. Let's copy this endpoint and let's look at the reports. So if you go through this posture assessment by endpoint report, you'll notice all the reports given irrespective of what agent type it is. So be it your agentless, stealth agent, temporal agent, persistent agent, you're going to get the reports from the different agent types. So how do I figure it out whether it is actually coming from a specific agent type, etc.? So if I filter it out based on this endpoint ID or the MAC address, you'll notice that we were trying to evaluate only one policy. The remaining policies, remember, those are trying application and hardware. That's a telemetry information that we were trying to retrieve. We are not even evaluating anything. We were trying to grab hardware inventory and application inventory from the endpointer. So apart from those 2 policies, there is one more policy that we were looking for an anti-malware install, whether it is installed or not. So it was met. Now, if I go to the even the context visibility, go to the compliance, filter out using that MAC address, and you could notice that this endpoint was already running and installed with so many applications. So it grabbed the installed applications and running applications on the endpoint. So if you click on it, you'll figure it out what are those applications installed and running on the endpoint. And if I go back to the dashboard, hardware dashboard, you would also notice that it was able to grab the BIOS serial number, devices attached to CPU, so on and so forth. So we were able to grab the application and hardware inventory from through the agentless posture profile, as well as we were able to assess the posture policies also using the agentless. That's how basically the agentless works. Now coming down to the last agent type called a temporal agent. So the temporal agent was giving you flexibility not to install any agent on the endpoint, but however, with the temporal agent executable file, we can get the posture assessment of an endpoint. So how does it work? When the endpoint connects to the network for the first time, it's the same thing, but instead of actually provisioning Cisco Secure Client or an agentless plugin, we can actually provision the temporal agent through the client provisioning portal. So this temporal agent is nothing but an executable file on the Windows or a Mac operating system. And these executable file automatically discovers the PSN, retrieves the posture policies, evaluates them, sends the report back to the ISE in order to get the compliant or non-compliant access accordingly. So that once after assessment is done, the temporal agent, the executable file, is going to automatically gets deleted. So if at all you are wondering to run the reassessment again and again, it's not possible with a temporal agent. So I'm going to come down to the differences amongst all these agent types a little bit later, but let me walk you through the demonstration of a temporal agent now. Now let's go to the Posture Work Center policy elements. Remember, we have to define an authorization profile in order to redirect them to a client provisioning page. So I have already defined an authorization profile called temporal agent provisioning. And what exactly is over here? We were redirecting them to the client provisioning page with an initial ACL enforced on it. And using this authorization rule or authorization profile, we want to create one policy or an update existing policy. Let's update the existing policy. So instead of actually redirecting them to client provisioning page to provision the Cisco Secure Client, we wanted to actually provision the temporal agent. So let's create one more policy. So instead of a posture unknown access, I'm going to associate this rule to a temporal agent provisioning. So let all other policies, rules remain as is. So as long as it is compliant, irrespective whether it is an agentless, temporal, or a persistent agent, all compliant devices are going to get a compliant access. All non-compliant devices are going to get a non-compliant access. So that's what we wanted to give. Doesn't matter whether they were coming through different agent types. So now that we have defined the rules, let's figure it out. Do we have a latest temporal agent in order to run the posture service on the endpoint? So I've already downloaded the latest one. If you look at, let's expand this. If you notice that we have two temporal agents, one is 4.10 and another one is 5.1.6.6. So I'm going to provision 5.1.6.6 through the client provisioning portal. So go to the client provisioning. So let's modify this Windows client provisioning policy. Earlier, we were making use of the same client provisioning policy to provision the Cisco Secure Client. So instead of that, I'm going to now associate it to a 5.1.6.6 temporal agent. Now that we have defined everything, let's enable some of the posture policies in order to assess the posture assessment. So let's make use of the default posture policies for temporal agent. Let's enable anti-malware for a temporal agent on Windows. Let's grab the applications as well using the temporal agent. And let's also look for a firewall enabled policy. using the temporal agent on Windows. And let's try to enable hardware attributes to be retrieved using the temporal agent on Windows. And that's it. Save the configuration. Now that we have defined and configured everything that we required through for temporal agent, let's flip over to the endpoint, connect to the network. So just to tell you, this was a .1x authenticated device. So now if I try to access anything, it will try to get redirected to the client provisioning portal. And this one now was looking for temporal agent, whether it was running already or not. Click on this is what to do next time. Download the temporal agent executable file, run it, and it tries to contact the PSN, retrieves the posture policies, evaluates them, and gives me compliant access. So that's how basically initially we redirected them to the client provisioning page to provision the temporal agent. Using the temporal agent, we got the compliant access. So ICE did a COA to give them a compliant access to it. Now let's flip over to the report section. As I said earlier, you're basically getting the report irrespective of whether it is from a temporal agentless or a persistent agent, stealth agent, etc. So in order to figure it out the differences, the agent type mentioned over here is going to give the difference with what agent that you are receiving the agent type. Now, if you look at the policies that we have evaluated, apart from the retrieving the application and the hardware inventory, we were trying to look for an anti-malware installation and a firewall enabled policy. So both of them are passed. That's the reason why it was compliant. Now let's flip over to the compliance context visibility dashboard. Let's look for this endpoint. This is the endpoint. And through the temporal agent itself, we were able to grab the application inventory, applications installed on the endpoint and running on the endpoint. Go back to the context visibility again, hardware section to figure it out whether it was able to retrieve the hardware attributes. Yes, it was able to retrieve. So that's how it works for the temporal agent. Now that we have seen different agents and how they work, it's time to let you know what are the differences amongst all these different agent types. And if you look at it, the capabilities over here, as and when you go towards the right side, the agentless was having a lesser capabilities than the persistent agent. Now, it means if at all you're looking for a visibility, etc., or a basic security checks, you can go with an agentless. But from an end user standpoint, a user experience standpoint, or if you want to actually go through a lot more security protection policy, something like a remediations, reassessments, patch management, a scripter, etc., you're supposed to basically use the Cisco persistent agent rather than the agentless. So that's what the recommendation from us. Now, I wanted to give one more because in earlier demonstration, in earlier part one, we were not able to actually show you the log analytics using the 3.4. So right now, I was making use of a 3.4. So this is a beta version. Don't get confused with the version number. This is 3.4. And if you look at the log analytics, along with the radius, TechAx, profile analytics dashboards, which are available in earlier releases, we are also giving the posture analytics. So you got a posture script condition audit, posture remediation, posture assessment by endpoint, posture assessment by condition, everything. So you don't have to actually run the posture assessment reports. So I would, I really like this because it will give me the analytics rather than actually running static reports. So I'm going to show you how. So let's click on the posture assessment by endpoint. Let's run it for last 24 hours and see So these are the 7 unique endpoints which are going through the posture assessment. You could clearly see what are the different endpoints that we are getting connected to the network, and how many endpoints got a compliant access, how many of them are still in pending state, how many of them are in grace compliant state, how many of them are non-compliant, etc. So you basically click on them in order to filter it out those endpoints as well. How beautiful it is. The second dashlet visualization, we should call it as visualization in terms of a Kibana. So you will also come to know from a specific endpoint how many posture records that we have received. So 53 times that we have received report from one specific endpoint. And you could also clearly see the time graph over a period of time, how your posture assessment happening for all your endpoints. So you could clearly see all the endpoints are meeting the criteria, or any of the endpoints are not meeting the criteria. Let's imagine the situation, your security administrator pushed the updates and you're looking for the latest patches. So some of the endpoints might become non-compliant in that case. So there might be a shooting above for non-compliant status. So you can clearly get to know from this analytics. And if you at all you have enforced a PRA, you could also clearly see how many periodic reassessments happened, and how many endpoints were associated to a specific PRA action. And you could clearly uh, see what is the continue log of remediation assessment, enforcement type enabled with a PRA, enabled at a PRA. Let's look at the posture assessment by condition also. So you can clearly see these are the conditions that we were looking, irrespective whether it is a Windows, Mac, or a Linux operating system. These are the conditions that we were looking for. And you can clearly see what are the conditions which are matched against the endpoints, which are the conditions skipped, and what are the conditions which are failed against the endpoints. So you can clearly figure it out how many endpoints are not meeting the specific criteria, etc. So this is going to be very useful, and this is the layout of your entire endpoint versus the policies. So how beautiful it is. I feel the reports are going to be, I mean, the Kibana is going to be used more than the reports going forward. So with that, I wanted to actually conclude with the references. These are the references available. And before even we wind up our call, Rigo, do we have any outstanding questions to answer?
Yeah, thank you, Pavan. I just had a look at our Q&A panel here, and we actually do not have any outstanding questions. Our wonderful panelists have done an amazing job of addressing all of the inquiries, so I think we're good to go.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, folks. I hope it is helpful for you. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Uh, well, I just want to give you a big thank you, Pavan, for speaking about this topic with our audience. I hope that everyone found great value in the information and resources that were shared here today. I would also like to extend a very big thank you to each and every one of our panelists again for lending a hand with all of the questions throughout the webinar. We really appreciate it. And for our attendees, if you do have any additional questions or would like to continue the conversation about today's topic, we do encourage you to participate in our online post-webinar discussion. You are going to be redirected there upon exit, but the link will be posted in the chat window here in just a moment, in case you'd like to save it for you to visit it a little later. So we do look forward to your participation there. And also a quick reminder that you will receive a short pop-up survey as soon as you exit the webinar, and we would really appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes to complete it and let us know how you like today's presentation. We always look forward to receiving your valuable feedback. And for those of you who are interested in revisiting this session, we will have the recording available for on-demand viewing within approximately 5 business days after today. And the links have been posted into the chat window there for your reference, but I'm going to go ahead and repost them again momentarily, just in case you missed them. So please do look into the chat window there in a moment for those links. And again, a quick reminder about our next webinar. So next month, we're going to be hosting ICE API and automation setup. That's going to be on Tuesday, August 6th. Registration for this session is open. So if your time permits, we do invite you to join us for this webinar and register if you haven't done so already. I'm going to go ahead and repost a link to that registration page in just a moment as well into the chat window. And we look forward to seeing you all there next month. Thanks again to our presenter, Pavan, to our panelists, and to all of our attendees for joining us here live. I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.